Welcome into Survivor Analytics. I am your host, Clyde, and today I will be walking through my player ranking for the cast of Survivor 47. I make one of these videos after every Survivor season that we cover on our podcast, and this is now the 7th ranking that I've completed. The primary criteria that I follow for these rankings is strategic dominance. In other words, how instrumental were these contestants in directing the season towards a potential win? For me, this was the most difficult cast to rank because there was never a dominant strategic force on the season. Genevieve mentions this in the reunion, but it feels like just about every player has moments where they fall in and out of the majority. I also need to consider the influence of advantages and challenges in this ranking, as those are factors that, in my opinion, fall outside the realm of strategic dominance. This is probably the strangest list that I've produced so far, but we can hop right in.
At number 18, I got a contestant who I adored from a character perspective. On a personal level, I didn't want to rank this player this low. It's Jon. For me, it's difficult to look past some of the major negatives in Jon's game, the biggest being the Andy factor. When Andy blows up at the first immunity challenge of the season, Jon has the golden opportunity to push the target in that direction. At the end of the day, though, Jon failed to really establish any alliances within the Gada tribe. He's taken out in their first tribal council in a unanimous vote. The fact that Jon never found an ally who actually remained loyal to him dropped him below those early boots on Tuku and Lavo. Combining the lack of alliances and the inability to direct the vote onto the clear bottom feeder of Gada and Andy, I will rank Jon here at number 18. On to number 17, we have another early pre-merge boot in TK. I was shocked when TK went out in episode 2, as he's the type of player that generally survives through the merge. TK's strongest asset is the physical side of the game, so for TK to get voted out in the first Tuku tribal council, he needed to stumble out of the gate. His comments at the second immunity challenge ultimately influenced Tiyana into flipping against him. My main reason for placing TK at 17 as opposed to 18 is his relationship with Kyle. Kyle stays loyal to TK to the bitter end as they vote together in that first Tuku tribal council. It's still a pretty rough game at large. It lands him here at number 17. At number 16, we have the second podcaster to appear on this list in Aysha. Just like Jon and TK before her, Aysha was voted out at the earliest opportunity, which drops her to the bottom section of this list. Unlike those other early boots, I feel that there are some murky circumstances surrounding Aysha's elimination. Going into that first Lavo Tribal Council, I do not believe that Aysha was genuinely on the bottom. Rome stood as the consensus target, but he held an immunity idol that was valid for just one round. With Rome immune, the dynamics shift, and the pairing of Tini and Kishan ultimately flip against Aysha. In that elimination, you can definitely criticize Aysha for her unwillingness to throw her ally Saul under the bus. In fact, I feel that Aysha did more actively wrong leading to her boot, but the entire situation surrounding Rome's idol was enough to boost her on the list to number 16. Then at number 15, I have someone who really defined the pre-merge of the season. It's arguably the biggest villain of the new era in Rome. Rome's ranking was probably the most difficult one for me out of the pre-merge eliminations. There's no denying that Rome held substantial agency throughout that first section of the game, but I feel that most of Rome's influence derived from twists and advantages. I don't think that Rome ever built the foundational alliances necessary to navigate through the season. In the early days of Lavo, Rome immediately paints a target on his back through his aggressive search for the idol, and if he failed to find that advantage, he's likely the first boot from that tribe. Rome contributes to the elimination of Aysha in the first Lavo Tribal Council, but I feel that the pairing of Tini and Kishan were the ones taking the lead on that vote. Going into the second Lavo Tribal Council, it looked like Rome was the consensus target once again, but this time he's randomly selected for a journey where he acquires a vote steal through pure chance. That advantage completely flips Rome's positioning within the tribe, but it's not due to the active work of Rome himself. When Rome elects to play that advantage, he uses it to knock out Kishan over Saul in a move that benefited Genevieve's game more than his own. This decision preserved Rome's biggest rival in Saul for the merge section of the season. Then at the mergatory, Rome's hyper-aggressive playstyle finally catches up to him as he attempts to push the target onto Kyle. Rome gets voted out there nearly unanimously as a player that no one on the island could really trust. So in looking at Rome's game at large, I can understand the argument for placing him lower on the list due to his inability to form legitimate trusting alliances. Rome's strategic agency, while based in advantages, is still worth acknowledging. It's enough to earn him the number 15 spot. At number 14, I have the second GOTY contestant to appear on this list in Anika. Anika starts the season well positioned within the GOTY tribe, as she locks down a number 1 ally in Rachel and works within the majority for the Jon boot. After the premiere though, Anika's game starts to fall off the rails as she falls to the bottom of the tribe without knowing that she's on the bottom. In episode 3, she attends a journey where she loses her vote through circumstances completely outside her own control, but even without any agency in the second GOTY tribal council, Anika could have survived that round if she could convince Sierra to stick with herself and Rachel in targeting Andy. According to Sierra herself, Anika and Rachel did a poor job at masking their alliance. Sierra knew that by siding with that pair, she was number 3 on the totem pole. I would also note that Anika struggles in the realm of threat level management. When Sierra elects to align with the duo of Andy and Sam, they decide to target Anika over her ally Rachel. So Anika was an interesting character on this season. I loved her minor feuds with Sam, as well as her raw reaction at Tribal Council, but her game was a bit underwhelming. She's here at number 14. Moving along to number 13, we have the first player on my list who reached the merge in Tiyana. I feel that Tiyana is one of those contestants who really benefited from her tribe's challenge success in the pre-merge. In the first Tuku Tribal Council, Tiyana works with the majority to knock out TK, and theoretically, that move would build alliances for Tiyana while isolating Kyle, but she fails to work her way into the core of that group. In fact, Tiyana's active decisions after episode 2 serve to push her to the outskirts of Tuku. She publicly throws Gabe under the bus at the Survivor Social. That information eventually leaks back to Gabe and gives him an incentive to target Tiyana. Later on, Tiyana realizes that Sue acquired an idol, but she never approaches Sue with that information, and as a result, Sue gains an incentive to take out Tiyana. Then we get to episode 7, where Tiyana goes out in a weird split tribal council where the original target of Rachel is saved through a twist in the game. I understand that some people will look at that episode and claim that Tiyana was screwed over by production, but I don't see it that way. When Rachel plays the safety without power advantage and leaves the tribal council area, Tiyana is left with only the original members of the Tuku tribe. This was a group of players that Tiyana knew for the previous 2 weeks on the island. She had the opportunity to build inroads with those contestants, and she's taken out in a unanimous vote. To me, the fact that Tiyana goes out there reveals that she likely would have been the consensus target had Tuku attended a second pre-merge tribal council. So while there were some unlucky circumstances surrounding Tiyana's elimination, I didn't see her going much further on the season due to her non-existent relationships on Tuku. She ranks here at number 13. At number 12, I have the highest ranked player to go out in the pre-merge in Kishan. I feel that Kishan's game was disrupted by production-infused twists more so than any other contestant on this list. He starts the season operating the middle of the Lavo tribe alongside Teeny. When that pair narrows the potential targets to Saul and Aysha, Kishan is the one that pushes the vote in Aysha's direction. That move simultaneously cuts one of Teeny's secondary allies while maintaining the Saul-Rome rivalry. On paper, I agree with that decision by Kishan, but we later learn that he should have used that opportunity to take out Genevieve instead. In episode 4, Genevieve disagrees with Kishan's original plan to target Rome, and she responds by flipping the vote onto Kishan himself, a move that required Rome's vote steal. This is a clear example of someone losing control of the game through external advantages. Rome did not find the vote steal on the Lavo Beach. He was randomly selected to attend a journey where he won the advantage through a game of chance. If literally anyone else on the cast earns that advantage, then Kishan maintains the numbers to take out Rome in that second Lavo Tribal Council. With that said, I think you can still fault Kishan's move to take out Aysha, as he knew about Rome's vote steal prior to that Tribal Council. In other words, Kishan could have anticipated the threat of that advantage before cutting the Lavo numbers. I still think that Kishan plays easily the best game of the pre-merge boots on Survivor 47. He lands here at number 12.
Then at number 11, I have one of the most popular players of Survivor 47. This is someone who floated through the game with little agency, operating mainly on the periphery of his alliances. It's Saul. I think that Saul was rarely instrumental to the strategic direction of the season, where from the jump, he's pushed to the outside of the Lavo tribe as he loses his number one ally in Aysha. He's then out of the loop on the Kishan blind side, which actually ends up being good for Saul's game as it strengthens his bond with Teeny. At the Mergatory, Saul contributes to the Rome blind side, effectively knocking out his main enemy in the game, but I don't get the sense that Saul was the one leading that vote. The edit highlights Kyle more as the head strategist of that operation. Then in the Split Tribal Council, Saul makes his biggest move of the season in saving Rachel with the take-your-pick advantage. I have a difficult time really crediting Saul for that move, as Rachel was clearly presented as the player on the bottom. She was the single Gata contestant surrounded by 5 Tuku players. To me, playing that advantage on Rachel is a no-brainer, but in the end, this move fails to ever establish a legitimate alliance with Rachel. She contributes to the Saul vote at the final 10. Speaking of the Saul blindside, while he goes home in 10th place, I will credit Saul in that he maintained allies in the game like Teeny and Sam, who were actively working to save him. All in all, I think that Saul plays a very rocky pre-merge game, and his brief time in the post-merge is not impressive enough to overcome those early struggles. I have him here at number 11. On to number 10, we can cover the challenge beast of the season in Kyle. I know that some people will want to see Kyle ranked higher on the list due to his success in the physical side of the game. Kyle competes in 6 individual immunity challenges, and he wins 4 of them, which is great for my assessment of him as a player. But when I look strictly at his game on 47, there are many points where Kyle is either coasting by on the periphery of his main alliance or straight up outside the majority. We see in that first Tuku Tribal Council, Kyle is the only player excluded from the TK boot. After that tribal, Kyle is on the bottom. He then loses his vote on a journey, and he openly shares this information with the rest of his tribe, which seems like a pretty risky play. Kyle works to overcome his poor positioning, but he typically fails in his various schemes. For example, Kyle learns that Gabe considers Sue an easy beat, and he shares this information with Sue, who doesn't believe him. Tuku only attends 1 tribal council in the pre-merge, but had they lost another challenge, it's either Tiyana or Kyle booted from that group. At the Mergatory, Kyle pulls off his best strategic move of the season in leading the vote against Rome. It's a mark on Kyle's resume, but it's also one that's facilitated by the mistakes of Rome as his hyper-aggressive playstyle finally catches up to him. Later on, at the final 12, Kyle walks into the Split Tribal Council fully prepared to vote out Rachel, which is a poor read on his end. Had Kyle knocked out Rachel there, the Tuku tribe comes across as this tight-knit group that's likely targeted in the following round. Out of those Tuku contestants, Kyle has the biggest target on his back due to his immunity win streak. Between the final 11 and final 10, Kyle works on the outside of the Tuku alliance and contributing to the eliminations of Sierra and Saul. But then we get to the final 9, which really lowered my overall evaluation of Kyle. Kyle wins individual immunity there, which earns him a degree of power. Yet he elects to vote with the majority in taking out his biggest shield in the game in Gabe. In my opinion, Gabe is the absolute worst person to target in that scenario. Kyle must know that he cannot win every challenge moving forward, so he needs a scapegoat for those rounds where he's vulnerable. It's no surprise when Kyle loses immunity at final 8 and he's voted out of the game because there were no more shields to push in front. So I think Kyle played a very impressive physical game of Survivor. He's one of the best challenge competitors that we've seen in the new era. But when you expand outward and look at Kyle's strategic decisions, you'll find that he's oftentimes working against his best interest, especially with that Gabe vote at the final 9. I'll rank him here at number 10. Then at number 9, we have someone who really stumbled their way through the season. This is a player who never really got their way at Tribal Council, and I ultimately elected to put them this high on the list due to their placement. It's Teeny. While I love Teeny as a Survivor character, I cannot look past the fact that they never hold any strategic agency on the season. Teeny is a player that's constantly in and out of the majority, and even in those times where they're included on the vote, they are agreeing to plans that are bad for them in the long term. While Teeny makes it to the finale, it feels like they only reach that point because the other contestants know that Teeny cannot win a jury vote. The only time in 47 where Teeny holds any legitimate control is the pre-merge, where Teeny and Kishan operate the middle in that first Lavo Tribal Council. Despite holding power in that round, Teeny elects to knock out Aysha, who was probably their second closest ally in the game. While that move draws Saul closer to them, it's still an instance of Teeny forfeiting control and agreeing to plans that benefit other players' games more than their own. After that round, Teeny's game steadily declines for the rest of the season. In the second Lavo Tribal Council, they are blindsided by the Kishan vote, which, to be fair, derives from somewhat unlucky circumstances as it requires Rome's possession of a vote steal. Moving on to the merge, Teeny connects with Sierra from the Gada tribe. When Sam and Sierra come forward as the primary targets at Final 11, Teeny attempts and fails to push the vote in Sam's direction. Instead, they lose one of their few cross-tribal alliances. You can follow that up with the final 10, where Teeny loses their number one ally in Saul. Teeny technically votes correctly in both of those tribal councils, but they only do so as a way of not isolating themselves from the rest of the tribe. By the time Teeny reaches the final 9, there were not many stable allies left for them, and they never recover from this position. In that round, Teeny is temporarily pulled back into the majority for the Gabe vote. That opens the door for Teeny's Underdog Alliance to take control at Final 8. They do get their way in that tribal council, knocking Kyle out of the game. So that stretch in the early merge is solid for Teeny as they are safely within the majority alliance and executing on their various schemes. We get to the final 7 where Teeny is blindsided by the Caroline boot. While the vote does not play out in Teeny's favor, what's even worse is Teeny's social game in that round. We see Teeny belittle Sam behind his back for not selecting them on reward. Had Teeny reached the final tribal council, I bet this information would circle back to haunt them. Then at tribal, we see a cocky side to Teeny where they claim that a boot order has been established. Those comments are particularly ridiculous because even if Teeny got their way and the Underdog Alliance took control of the game, I don't know who Teeny beats in a jury vote. I feel like they were drawing dead by that point in the season. That takes us to the final 6, where I think Teeny makes the correct read in flipping against Rachel, but their approach to that flip is pretty poor. Teeny runs to the Operation Italy Alliance immediately after Tribal Council, which makes it blatantly obvious to Rachel that she is the target of the upcoming vote. Had Teeny operated that round with a bit more stealth, there is a world where they could have made Rachel feel comfortable enough to hold on to her idol. By the time Teeny reaches the final 4, they have no shot at winning in any final tribal council combination. Despite their low jury stock, they are still thrown into fire-making by Rachel. Teeny ends up going out in 4th place, and I look at their game as one of the worst final juror performances of the new era. This is a player who never held much control. They were strong-armed into voting out many of their closest allies, like Sierra and Saul in the early merge, and they never maintained the social bonds to potentially overcome their lackluster strategic game had they reached the final tribal. The only factor that made me consider ranking Teeny higher on the list is the fact that they landed in 4th place. The route to that placement is very shaky. I'll put Teeny here at number 9. Then at number 8, I have a contestant who I was very high on in the pre-merge. I think this player dominated her original tribe in the early game, only to lose control in the back half, and that's Sierra. Sierra has a serious argument for the best pre-merge game on the cast of Survivor 47, where she's immediately positioned in the majority with the number 1 ally in Sam. After the Jon boot, Sierra is the key swing vote with the pair of Andy and Sam on one side, then Anika and Rachel on the other. At the second Gada Tribal Council, Sierra ultimately decides to align with the men in voting out Anika. We later learn that this was the wrong choice as Andy flips against Sierra at Final 11, but I don't know if voting out Andy would have done much for Sierra's long-term trajectory on the season. If Andy goes home in that tribal council over Anika, Sierra still walks into the merge with a target on her back due to her obvious alliance with Sam. We also need to remember that Anika was a lead voice calling out that partnership, so I doubt that Sierra's fate drastically changes if she made a different decision. In reality, the best move for Sierra in that tribal council was probably to vote out Sam, but that was just unrealistic given that he held an idol that was only valid for one round. Later on at the Mergatory, Sierra makes the crucial mistake of allowing Andy's name to be used as the backup vote. That move helps Andy realize that he's on the periphery of Gada, and it incentivizes him to flip against Sierra 2 episodes later. You can also fault Sierra for her elimination, where the cast elected to take her out over Sam, who comes across as your prototypical early merge boot. So overall, I think Sierra showed a lot of game ability on this season. I look at her as a well-rounded player who had some missteps in the early merge. She ranks here at number 8. On to number 7, I have a contestant who, like Sierra, dominates his starting tribe and mismanaged his threat level in the early merge. It's Gabe. Gabe's game is an interesting one where he's always working within the majority Tuku alliance and maintaining substantial agency. The issue with Gabe's navigation through the season is that he's too out in front, to the point where other players perceive him as a threat and actively target him. From the beginning, Gabe solidifies his primary alliance with Sue and Caroline by showing them his immunity idol. That trio pulls Tiyana onto their side for the TK boot, and through that move, Gabe's group has complete control over Tuku. Later on, when Tiyana attempts to paint a target on Gabe at the Survivor Sanctuary, Sue reports this information back to Gabe himself, which speaks to the quality of their relationship. Had Tuku attended another tribal council in the pre-merge, Gabe's alliance likely sticks together to knock out Tiyana or Kyle. In fact, we later see Gabe accomplish this goal at the Split Tribal after Rachel gets saved by the take your pick advantage. It's important to note that Gabe walked into that Split Tribal with the intention of voting out Rachel, which I don't see as a great move for him. It would have further incentivized the other players to vote out a Tuku member in the next round, and Gabe's name would be towards the top of that list. At Final 10, Gabe contributes to the Saul blind side. We see Genevieve approach Gabe with this idea due to his reputation as the leader of Tuku. I feel that move by Genevieve really highlighted Gabe's poor threat level management. Then we get to the Final 9, where Gabe is voted out due to the looming threat of the Tukus taking the numbers advantage. In his elimination, Gabe loses the support of both Caroline and Kyle, as neither of them believe that they could beat him in a jury vote, which is not a great look. I will say that Gabe got a bit unlucky in that round with Kyle winning individual immunity. If Kyle is vulnerable in that tribal council with 3 immunity wins on his resume, I think the non-Tukus elect to take out Kyle over Gabe. So ranking Gabe's game is difficult in that I don't think that there's a particular vote where he messes up. Gabe makes the correct strategic decision every step of the way, but he's overly active in those conversations leading up to Tribal Council. He continues to reinforce others' perceptions of him as the leader of Tuku, which would have materialized in jury votes in the end, but it also narrowed his path to that point. It lands him here at number 7. Then at number 6, we have a player who was well positioned throughout the season, but lacked both win equity and strategic agency. It's Sue. I never got the sense that Sue ever grabbed control of the game. For the entire season, she works as a second in command, hiding behind her various allies and enabling them to take the lead in strategic decisions. She starts the season working in the shadows of Gabe. When Gabe is voted out, she pivots to Caroline, and when Caroline goes home, she latches onto Rachel. On one hand, this approach offers Sue a lot of safety, where outside the first Tuku tribal, she's never seriously targeted. On the other hand, Sue is never respected as a jury threat. In the post-merge, we get confessionals from Andy and Genevieve describing Sue as an emotional player and easy beat. These perceptions are later confirmed in the finale, where Sue does not receive a single jury vote. As I mentioned, Sue is well positioned on the original Tuku tribe. She navigates her way into the middle of the dominant power structure, connecting with Gabe and Caroline. Based on the edit of 47, it seems like both of those players fully trusted Sue. Both of them intended on rolling with her to the end, but I don't know if that long-term outlook was based in their alliance or based in Sue's reputation as an easy beat. Later on in the pre-merge, Sue hears Tiyana targeting Gabe at the Survivor Sanctuary. She then leaks this intel back to Gabe himself, which plays a part in Tiyana going out in the split tribal council. In the early merge, Sue coasts within the majority. She's a part of the plan to knock out Sierra, she's in the loop on the Saul blind side, but then we get to the final 9, which marks her first major blunder of the season. There, Sue is straight up excluded from the consensus plan to knock out Gabe. Not even Caroline elects to rope her into that scheme, which is all pretty bad. Then at the final 8, Sue is able to recover. She locks down Caroline as her new number 1. She's pulled into the Underdog Alliance, and she serves as one of the lead voices in pushing the vote onto Kyle. That takes us to the final 7, which is another rough point for Sue, as she loses her number 1 ally in Caroline. That round is particularly bad for Sue in that the Caroline boot was completely avoidable. Sue held an immunity idol. She had the opportunity to protect Caroline, which would have served as a major stamp on her resume. Sue follows up that tribal council with some very questionable play where, despite the other contestants blatantly crowning Rachel as the biggest threat in the game, Sue attaches herself to Rachel's hip. She works alongside Rachel in the Andy blindside at Final 6. The edit portrays that move as Rachel's flip, but post-game press reveals that Sue was the main person pushing the target in that direction. While I need to credit Sue for maintaining agency in that round, I still need to fault her in that the jury interprets that blindside as Rachel's move. Rachel has the flashy idol play at Tribal Council, and her parting words to Andy ensures that she receives all of the credit. Through the last 2 rounds of the game, Sue continues to present herself as Rachel's sidekick. At Final 4, she accepts Rachel's offer to take her to the final tribal. In the end, Sue receives 0 jury votes against Sam and Rachel, and I don't think she wins really any final tribal council combination. So for me, Sue falls into the common category of passive 0-vote finalists. I think there's an argument in favor of Sue as one of the better 0-vote finalists of the new era, as she's in the loop much more often than the likes of Romeo from 42, or Owen from 43, or Jake from 45. I wouldn't have too much confidence in Sue winning any random season of Survivor, but her safety throughout the game, combined with her consistent play in the majority, earn her the number 6 spot. At number 5, I have a player that I already know that many people will disagree with. I was never particularly high on this contestant from a strategic perspective. It's the winner of the season in Rachel. I know what you're probably thinking. Rachel won the season. How could she possibly rank outside the top 4? As a player, I completely agree with you. If this ranking was based on a contestant's ability to perform well on any random season, I would probably put Rachel at number 2, only behind Genevieve. Looking exclusively at Rachel's strategic navigation through the season, I see this run as one of the 10 worst winning games in Survivor history. Andy brought this up in the finale, but there are many parallels between Rachel's game and Mike Holloway's from Survivor Worlds Apart. It's an entertaining win, but it's one where Rachel does not hold much strategic agency. She spends most of this season operating on the outside of the majority alliance, skating by through immunity wins and idol plays. While it's impressive that Rachel found a way to win those challenges and use that idol correctly, I take issue with the fact that those immunities were absolutely essential to her game. Despite never functioning as a dominant strategic figure, Rachel still mismanages her threat level and relies on factors outside her social and strategic game to navigate to the end. She's initially in the majority on the Gada tribe, taking out Jon in that first tribal council, but she then falls outside the main power structure. She's blindsided by the Anika boot in their second tribal, losing her number 1 ally in the process. I feel that Rachel deserves a lot of blame for that round, as Sierra stated postseason that her decision to flip was based in the fact that Rachel and Anika made it pretty obvious that Sierra would be number 3 in that alliance. Following that vote, Rachel is on the bottom, and had challenges broken a different way and Gada attended another tribal council, Rachel is voted out in the pre-merge, which is not great. Moving on to the merge, you have the split tribal at Final 12, where Rachel is initially swapped into a horrible position, outnumbered 5-1 by the opposing Tuku alliance. It's an unlucky spot for her, and going into tribal council, it looked like we were headed towards a unanimous Rachel vote. She is then saved by circumstances completely outside her own control, as Saul uses the take your pick advantage on her. Now, you could credit Rachel here for her relationship with Saul, but I see Saul's decision more as an anti-Tuku move rather than a pro-Rachel one. At the end of the day, I still look at this round as a slight negative for Rachel because she was nearly taken out. Plus, there are other winners in Survivor history who were thrown into similar situations and survived without relying on external advantages. Players like Amber Burkett and Tommy Sheehan faced similar splits, and they survived purely through their social adaptability. Then in the early merge, Rachel continues to operate on the outside of the majority with no real agency. She loses two of her allies back-to-back in Sierra and Saul. She has a solid play with her shot in the dark at Final 11, which helps save her idol for later in the post-merge. While that's an insightful move that elevates my opinion of Rachel as a Survivor player, it still occurs in a spot where Rachel is losing control of the game. The Final 8 is probably Rachel's best round, as she assembles this underdog alliance where she's positioned in the middle. We also see her volunteer for a journey as a way to prevent Sam and Genevieve from acquiring an advantage. She gets pretty lucky there in that she wins a 1 out of 3 rock draw to acquire a vote block. Even though Rachel is well positioned in that underdog alliance, she does not hold much strategic agency. In that round, she campaigns to knock out Genevieve, and the group elects to vote out Kyle instead. Then we get to the final 7, which is an absolute disaster for Rachel. She's the original target of Operation Italy, where without immunity, she's potentially taken out. She's then blindsided by the Caroline vote, which is horrible on multiple fronts. First, she agrees to split the vote from the majority, which opens the door for Andy to flip. Second, between her idol and vote block, Rachel held the tools to avoid that blindside entirely, and she plays neither of them. Third, what I consider the worst aspect of this round is the fact that Operation Italy causes Rachel to lose the trust of Teeny. After that tribal council, Rachel is on the bottom for the rest of the game. If she is vulnerable in any subsequent round, she's voted out. I know that some people will praise Rachel for surviving in that position, but I think it shows a complete lack of social insulation. At Final 6, we see Rachel take out Andy through an idol play, which impresses the jury. I think Rachel does a great job at Tribal Council, emphasizing her position as the clear target, increasing her win equity in front of the jury, knowing that she is setting herself up for this big move. It's important to note that, according to postseason interviews, Sue was the one really campaigning against Andy while Rachel wanted to knock out Sam. It's great that Rachel takes the credit for that Andy boot, but this still feels like a round where Rachel is not really directing the ship. We also need to admit that there is an element of luck surrounding Rachel's possession of the idol. This was not a case where Rachel sacrificed time at camp to go idol hunting. The clue was handed to her in her french fries at the auction. I feel that many people will view this round as Rachel's high point of the season, but I see it as one largely influenced by advantages. Without the french fry idol, Rachel is voted out of the game, and without the vote block, the Operation Italy alliance potentially splits the vote between Rachel and Sue, which cuts Rachel's final remaining ally. Then there's the final 5, where once again, Rachel is the biggest threat on the board. If literally anyone else wins immunity, she's voted out of the game, which I take issue with. In reality, Rachel wins immunity there, and it's a consensus vote against Genevieve. Then at Final 4, Rachel wins individual immunity, and she makes the correct read in not stepping into fire making. There again though, she's the biggest target in the game. I bet any other player would have thrown her into fire making. I do need to give Rachel a lot of credit for her win equity, as I think she beats just about anyone outside of Genevieve in the end. So overall, I look at Rachel's game as a challenge-based win. While Rachel has some impressive strategic moves like her shot in the dark play, I found that Rachel never held much agency on the season. Rachel's power often came through her immunity wins and idol plays. On top of that, she completely mismanages her threat level and relies on immunity through that back section of the game. I still considered putting Rachel higher on the list due to her general win equity and the fact that she actually won the season, but there's just too many holes in this run for me to put it any higher than the number 5 spot. On to number 4, I can rank the last contestant to actually reach the final tribal council. I got the runner-up of the season in Sam. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, this ranking is the wonkiest one that I've ever made. For the first time, none of the season's finalists landed in my top 3. I think that Sue, Rachel, and Sam all had major holes in their routes to the end. As for Sam, I look at his game on 47 as the lesser version of Genevieve's, who we will discuss later on the list. Like Genevieve, Sam holds a lot of agency in the pre-merge, but he falls to the bottom of the tribe in the second half, and he never really recovers from that position. Sam's best work of the season comes in the early game, where he runs the Gada tribe. He forms a close bond with Sierra, and they take out Jon in their first tribal council. Then in their second tribal, Sam aligns with the Outsider and Andy. He's able to convince Sierra to side with that pair in taking out Anika, blindsiding Rachel in the process. Within that new Gada trio, Sam works as the glue guy, connecting Sierra and Andy. The issue is that Sam fails to make all parties feel valued within that alliance. At Final 11, Andy elects to flip to the opposing Lavo and Tuku tribes to target that partnership. While Sierra ends up getting voted out over Sam, there are players like Teeny actively campaigning to knock out Sam. It feels like Sam survives that round, not through his social bonds, but through his stature as this shield for other players to push in front of them later in the game. It's also worth mentioning that the targeting of the Sierra-Sam duo does not come out of nowhere. In the pre-merge, Anika leaks information on that alliance to the other tribes. Had Sam managed his relationship with Anika better in the early game, then that pair has a better chance at operating under the radar. All of this is to say that the Sierra blindside is probably Sam's worst moment of the entire season. And after that elimination, he is on the bottom for the next 3 rounds. He's initially excluded from the Sol vote at Final 10. Rachel eventually ropes Sam into the mix, and he attempts to push the target in another direction, but he's ultimately unsuccessful. At Final 9, he approves of the Gabe blindside, but I never got the sense that Sam was the one directing the target in that round. Moving on to the Final 8, we see the assembly of the Underdog Alliance, which excludes Sam. Once again, Sam doesn't really know what's going on, as he's positioned as one of the 3 outsiders. Now, I will credit Sam as the underdogs debate between voting out Genevieve and Kyle, so he's pretty safe in that spot where Kyle goes home. But then we get to the Final 7, where Sam is involved in the Operation Italy alliance that takes Caroline out of the game. He's the least integral member to that plan. His role essentially boils down to laying low and providing Genevieve with his idol from the pre-merge. The jury itself later discredits Sam's value to that move in the final tribal council, which is not great. Sam rolls into the Final 6 with a clear winning avenue where, according to postseason interviews, Sam wanted to knock out Rachel at 6, then Genevieve at 5. That would have landed Sam at the Final 4 with a winning combination against Teeny and Sue. I still don't know if Sam could have defeated Andy in a jury vote. That scenario likely depends on the perceptions of Genevieve and Rachel entering the jury. Anyways, that entire long-term outlook for Sam is disrupted by immunities. Sam has the numbers in place to knock out Rachel at Final 6, only for her to play an idol. At Final 5, Rachel wins immunity again, and Sam makes the correct read in cutting Genevieve. Despite challenges not breaking in Sam's favor towards the end of the season, he still reaches the Final 4 with a winning combination against Teeny and Sue. I think that Sam's win equity is evidenced by the fact that Rachel throws him into the fire-making challenge, which he wins. In the final tribal council, Sam puts up a good fight, pulling off what I consider one of the best final speeches of the new era, but it was not enough. I thought Sam had a chance at earning the Andy vote, and I expected him to receive the Sierra vote, so him losing both of those was a bit of a shocker. So I think that Sam played a solid game of Survivor. I think there's an argument for placing him ahead of Genevieve, as he did a much better job at managing his threat level. At the same time though, I think that there are less examples of Sam running the show. Even in his best section of the game in the pre-merge, Sierra is the one operating the middle. I'll rank him here at number 4. At number 3, we have a player that exceeded my expectations, as she was invisible for the first 3 episodes of the season. It's Genevieve. Genevieve is an interesting player in that I think she was the biggest jury threat on the entire cast. While there was a very small chance that Genevieve would ever face off against Rachel in a final tribal, I'd bet if the two of them somehow met in the end, Genevieve narrowly squeaks out the win. That reputation is not really based in Genevieve's social game. Genevieve herself admits that early on, she took an emotional step back and perceived her relationships on the island more through a strategic lens than a personal one. Genevieve's jury stock comes from her strategic game, which has its highs and lows. From the beginning, she's in the majority on the Lavo tribe, connecting with an outsider in Rome, while building bonds with the pair of Kishan and Tini. In the second Lavo Tribal Council, Genevieve pulls off probably her best strategic move of the entire season as she convinces Rome to use his vote steal to take out Kishan. There is a part of me that takes issue with the targeting of Kishan, as it seemed like he was a contestant that was fully loyal to Genevieve, but at the same time, that move flushed Rome's vote steal, it broke up that Tini-Kishan pair, and it kept the rivalry between Rome and Saul alive. Had Lavo attended another pre-merge tribal council, it's either Rome or Saul going home. Moving ahead to the mergatory, Genevieve willingly cuts her closest ally in the game in Rome. Obviously, that's one less number for her to work with, but I have a difficult time really faulting Genevieve for that round, given Rome's actively poor play. I don't know if there was anything that Genevieve could have done to save Rome without coming forward as a target herself. In the early merge, we see Genevieve navigate her way into a pretty dominant position. At Final 11, she connects with the Tukus in directing the target onto Sierra. But then we get to the final 10, which I consider Genevieve's worst move of the season. In that round, she steps forward as the ringleader, pushing the vote onto Saul. While I don't hate the idea of knocking out Saul there, Genevieve presents herself as the undisputed orchestrator of this move. We see her pitching this idea really hard to players like Gabe, Andy, and Rachel. While Genevieve gets her way there, that move peaks her threat level, and she falls to the bottom of the tribe at the final 9. For the next 2 rounds, Genevieve is scraping by with no real strategic agency. She's a serious target in both the Gabe vote at final 9 and the Kyle vote at final 8. At final 7, Genevieve rebounds with the Operation Italy move that takes Caroline out of the game. She plays a part in that tribal council, convincing the majority underdog alliance that she held an idol, but I see Operation Italy as Andy's big move. Then we get to the final 6, where Genevieve is sitting in a solid spot. Tini flips over to her side, giving them the numbers advantage. Genevieve has the pieces in place to knock out Rachel, which doesn't pan out as Rachel idols Andy out of the game. That's an unlucky situation for Genevieve in that, out of all people, Rachel received a clue to an idol during the auction. At the same time though, it's important to remember that Genevieve won individual immunity in that round. Without the immunity necklace, I'm almost positive that Rachel would have targeted her over Andy. Even if Genevieve got her way and Rachel went out in 6th place, I don't know if there were many avenues for her to the final tribal. It seemed like every other player in the game pinpointed Genevieve as someone who could win a jury vote. With Rachel theoretically gone at 6, I bet Genevieve still comes forward as the consensus target at final 5. In a weird way, Genevieve benefits from Rachel's idol play. She walks into the final 5 with the numbers to vote out Rachel, and had anyone other than Rachel won individual immunity, she's voted out, and Genevieve walks into the final 4 as the biggest jury threat in the game. She would be just one fire-making challenge away from winning the season. Instead, the worst-case scenario plays out for Genevieve as Rachel wins individual immunity. At that point, even her closest ally in Sam betrays her, and Genevieve is taken out in 5th place. So I find Genevieve's run on Survivor 47 a pretty impressive game. Yes, she makes some active mistakes that peak her threat level and narrow her path to the end, but there are also sections of the game where Genevieve is in the power seat. She gets very close to the final 4, where she would have held a lot of win equity. I'll rank her here at number 3. Then at number 2, we have who I consider the most underrated contestant on the cast in Caroline. I know that Caroline never pulled off a wild strategic move that shocked the jury, but I think she was a stable force throughout the season. Caroline was very well positioned for her entire run on Survivor 47. Her name is not written down in a tribal council until her elimination episode, where, to be fair, she wasn't even the original target. Rachel was the intended target of Operation Italy, but she won individual immunity. But like I said, Rachel knows how to put herself into a majority alliance with shields in front of her. From the jump, she's in the majority of Tuku, working alongside Gabe and Sue. At the split tribal, she is the key swing vote in knocking out Tiyana. Then in the early merge, Caroline continues to work within the majority, as she's roped into the votes against Sierra and Saul. The Gabe blindside at Final 9 is some of Caroline's most impressive work. By taking Gabe out of the game, Caroline was able to take his spot as Sue's number 1 ally. That alliance was huge for Caroline's long-term outlook, as Sue was a player that no one on the jury really respected. Sue wanted to go to the final tribal with Caroline, and had they succeeded, Caroline crushes her in a jury vote. At Final 8, we see the assembly of the Underdog Alliance that includes Caroline. While that group is in power for just one round, Caroline gets her way in knocking out Kyle. And then we get to the Final 7, where Caroline stands in an incredible spot. The Underdog Alliance carves out a 4-person core that includes Rachel, Teeny, Caroline, and Sue. Had that group taken control of the game, Caroline reaches the Final 4 with a clear target in Rachel. This would put Caroline in a potential final tribal council against Teeny and Sue, where she easily wins the season. Instead, we see Andy flip against Caroline in Operation Italy. Caroline makes multiple mistakes in her own elimination. First, she agrees to Andy's split vote plan immediately after Andy attended reward with the bottom feeders in Sam and Genevieve. Now, that decision was based partially in Caroline attempting to give Andy a sense of agency within their alliance, but she still failed to anticipate his flip. Second, Caroline rejects Sue's offer to play her immunity idol. Caroline's side held the necessary advantages to overcome this minority alliance, and they still failed. The one positive aspect of Caroline's boot is the fact that she was not the initial target. If anyone other than Rachel won individual immunity, Caroline likely survives this round, and she is set up very well for the endgame. On top of all of Caroline's strategic achievements, I think that a major factor bolstering my opinion of her game is the jury's perception. I read through the season's pre-finale jury interviews, and there were many contestants applauding Caroline's game. It sounds like Caroline was great at outlining her strategy, describing how she subtly put other players in front of her as shields, which opened up her avenues to the end. So I look at Caroline as a player who was well insulated all season with consistent agency. She's ultimately taken out in one of the most strategically complex moves of the new era, but had she survived that round, I fully believe that she had a shot at winning the whole thing. So I'll rank here at number 2. And now, the number 1 spot, the player who I believe played the best game on Survivor 47 is Andy. While I've been high on Andy all season, I did not necessarily expect him to land at the top of the list. To be completely honest, even though I'm ranking Andy this high, I still see his run on Survivor as a very flawed one. Out of all the new era seasons covered on this podcast, I think that 47 is the weakest from a strategic perspective. Everyone on this cast has some major strategic mistakes in navigating through the season, and that's how you end up with a 6th place finisher, ranking number 1 overall. Looking at Andy's game, this is a player who is in the majority alliance for the entire season, including his elimination round. While we can debate Andy's degree of agency within his various groups, I think that he is always aware of his positioning. That awareness informs Andy's decisions as he flips between alliances throughout the season. But starting at the beginning, Andy has an atrocious premiere episode. His insecurity and poor challenge performance immediately isolate him on the Gada tribe, yet despite all of that, Andy survives their first tribal council without having his name written down. After the John boot, Andy recovers and builds trust with the duo of Sam and Sierra. That alliance forms partially through Andy's reputation as a non-threat, but also through the active work of Andy himself. He tells Sam that he found the Beware advantage, and he offers Sierra his shot in the dark. Those subtle moves integrate Andy within the majority, and at the second Gada Tribal Council, that trio works together to knock out Anika. Then we get to the Mergatory, which is a bit rocky for Andy. His name is used as the backup plan in the Rome boot, but Andy responds accordingly. He correctly identifies his lower position amidst the Gada alliance, and at the final 11, he serves as the first domino to fall in breaking up the Gadas and pushing the vote onto Sierra. It's a move that Andy could take some level of credit for if he were to sit in the final tribal. After that play, Andy falls into the background and enables other contestants to take the lead. Genevieve ropes him into the Saul blindside at final 10, and he's pulled into the consensus plan against Gabe at the final 9. Then at the final 8, we see the formation of the 5-person Underdog Alliance, which includes Andy, but he's not positioned particularly well in that group. The women of that alliance perceive Andy as the one that they're stringing along, the one that they can eventually cut at the final 5. When Andy pushes to knock out Genevieve, They reject his idea, voting out Kyle instead. Once again, Andy correctly identifies his position in that group, which inspires his flip at the final 7 with Operation Italy. I look at that move as one of the most impressive strategic plays of the new era. Despite Andy attending reward with the outsiders, he convinces the Underdog Alliance to not only split the vote, but do so in a way where Andy votes within the majority. Theoretically, that group should have put Andy in the minority of the split as a way to prevent him from flipping, but he convinces them otherwise. This enables Andy to flip again, this time taking out Caroline. What makes this move even more impressive to me is the sheer number of idols and advantages held by the Underdog Alliance. At that point, the underdogs held 2 idols and a vote block, but Andy makes them feel comfortable enough to not play any of them. Immediately following Operation Italy, Andy's group is able to pull Teeny onto their side, giving them the majority against Rachel at the final 6. Andy ends up going out in that round through pretty unlucky circumstances. First, you have the existence of Rachel's immunity idol, where without that idol, Rachel goes home. Second, you have Genevieve winning individual immunity. I bet if any other player wins immunity in that round, Genevieve comes forward as Rachel's target, and Andy survives to the final 5. With that said, Andy still deserves some degree of responsibility for his elimination. We see him prematurely hyping up his resume to Rachel, which inspires her to vote in the direction of Andy over Sam. At the end of the day, though, Andy is voted out in a round where he held the numbers advantage. To me, the biggest flaw on Andy's resume is not his strategic navigation through the season, it's his jury management. I never got the sense that the jury of 47 loved Andy. He receives this poor reputation in the premiere due to his actions during the first immunity challenge, and I don't think he ever fully shakes that perception. To be fair, we see Andy recognize that weak point in his game, and he takes active steps in resolving it. He pulls off the Operation Italy move, and he works to manage Rachel prior to her potential boot at the final 6. I'd also throw out that it seems like Andy knew how to describe his game in a way that would resonate with contestants in a final tribal. So who knows? In a world where Rachel goes out in 6th place, she potentially serves as a major advocate for Andy on the jury. Regardless, I fully believe that Andy beats Sue or Teeny in a jury vote, but he probably loses to Genevieve or Rachel. Even against Sam, a player with a worse strategic resume, I think that an Andy win is not guaranteed. This means that if Andy got his way, Rachel goes out at final 6, and he survives to the final 5, he's still working with narrow margins for error. So I think that Andy plays a pretty dominant game of Survivor, one where he works within the majority and rises to the surface at specific times to build his resume. Like I said at the beginning, I never anticipated ranking a mid-merge boot at the top, but given the quality of Andy's strategic game, as well as the circumstances surrounding his elimination, I feel confident putting him here at the number 1 spot. So there it is, my final ranking for the cast of Survivor 47. We got about 2 months until the start of Survivor 48. This is typically our off-season on the podcast. We hope to still upload a couple things in that 8-week stretch. I'm currently working on my ranking of every winning game of Survivor that I hope to release at some point. As we get closer to Survivor 48, we'll also run a fantasy draft. And of course, we'll be covering every single episode of that season as well. Thanks again for listening.